Hello everybody, I'm Betty Govenden. I studied at the University of Durban Westville when it was at Salisbury Island in the 60s, and then I continued as a lecturer at the University of Durban Westville and until we merged with the University of Natal, and I'm now a senior research associate at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I'm a grandmother, a mother, a mother-in-law, a feminist, and a teacher. And what else, Sam? I'm happy that we are here, and I'd like to congratulate the organizers for such a fine program. Our first speaker is Joy Joseph. And Joy is from the university that's currently known as Rhodes, and her topic is a Stiwanist study of selected works of Francophone authors. And for those of you who need to be reminded, Stiwanism is the acronym for social transformation in Africa, including women. So over to Joy.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. Somehow I tried to see how I could dodge this, but I couldn't, wondering why I am the very first speaker. Well, I'm a woman that has been packaged from different persons, and please permit me off camera to introduce some very packaged people from behind. The woman you see here has been packaged, off camera. My very amiable supervisor is here, Dr. Ato Mukenge, that's my supervisor. He's packaged me, and then on Tuesday, everything went off. System not responding. But I have known as a woman not to accept defeat. So I had to call everybody that I know, including the ICT department. You must get out something. Now let me say that the Senegalese writer, Mariama Ndoye, she said, La vie est un champ de bataille. On lutte jusqu'au jour de la mort. That is, life is a battlefield. You fight till the day you die. Stiwanism, social transformation, including women of Africa. That's our topic. Now, I'm going to be treating West Africa. This is what we expect to see in the community. Happy people, happy man and wife, happy children, everybody collaborating. Like I said I was the first presenter. So I had to look for how you can be happy, how you can be relaxed, and how you can understand what I'm trying to say. So that's why you see me bring all these beautiful pictures here to tell you what we expect to see in our society. Abstract. This study intends to examine how male and female authors portray the male characters in selected Francophone novels. Over the years, the African woman has been oppressed, marginalized, and humiliated. She seemingly has no voice in the traditional African society, which is termed patriarchal. Women are generally considered as an inferior sex, according to Simone de Beauvoir. This study intends to examine how Francophone authors portray the conditions and images of the African woman through selected works of authors like Ramon Sanusi, L'Historie de l'âme, and Baba Nazaratu's Vie de femme, vie de sang. These prolific authors have written topics that affect the conditions of women in the 21st century, such as polygamy, single motherhood, female genital mutilation, unwanted pregnancy, abortion, and sterility. The study seeks to plead for social change with respect to Maura Leslie's Ogundispe theory of Stiwanism, an African type of feminism, which advocates for social transformation in relation to women of Africa and their role in the society. According to Ogundispe, the new term Stiwa describes her agenda for women in Africa. The theory allows for us to discuss the needs of African women today against the backdrop of social cultural challenges in relation to African tradition. This comparative study will highlight the perceptions of Francophone authors and their views on the contemporary issues regarding the image and condition of the African woman and how she can be empowered to bring about social change in her community. Introduction. The traditional African society is a society where the woman has no voice. She's expected to be seen and not heard. This is portrayed in the Yoruba proverb which says, Ile ti obirin ba se atoto arere, iga rere wunibe. Arere tree grows in a home where a woman's voice is heard. Let me explain. Arere tree is a big tree that is used for carpentry. Now, this tree does not grow within the vicinity of the environment. The tree grows in the forest, and it gives a bad smell, a foul smell. So when a woman stands up to speak, in the traditional African society with its patriarchal, she's seen to be what? From that proverb, you understand how it is, how women are seen in the traditional African society. Women swore. This relegates the woman to a second class. The woman is assumed to be a second class according to Putuma etc. Chinyere Grace Okafor, in her article, Modern African Literature and Bovarism, explains the Igbo concept of the African woman as Uwa Umuwanyi, women's sword, and that of the woman as Uwaja, a life of stand, everyone will die and go back to the earth. This implies that the man and the woman do not belong to the same world. This indicates why the Stiwanist theory advocates for a social change. What is Stiwanism? Stiwanism is a theory pioneered by Morella Leslie Ogundipe in her book, Recreating Herself. This is Recreating Herself. This is the book. According to Ogundipe, Stiwanism is feminism in an African context. I have since advocated the word Stiwanism instead of feminism to bypass these concerns and to bypass the combative discourses that ensue whenever one raises the issue of feminism in Africa. The creation of the new world is to deflect energies from constantly having to respond to charges of imitating Western feminism, and in this way, conserve those energies to avoid being distracted from the real issue of the conditions of women in Africa. STIWA is my acronym for social transformation, including women in Africa. Stiwanism, the new term, allows me to discuss the needs of African women in the tradition of the spaces and strategies provided in our indigenous cultures for social being of women. Stiwa is about the inclusion of women in the contemporary social and political transformation of Africa. Be a Stiwanist. Stiwanism is not supposed to be identified only with men. A man can also be a Stiwanist. Now we're going to be looking at two conditions for this study. We're going to be looking at two conditions of the African woman: female genital mutilation and domestic violence. These are conditions that are portrayed in the books I'm going to look at. So this is L'Obisterie de l'âme. This is L'Obisterie de l'âme. This is what L'Obisterie de l'âme looks like. Now, images of domestic violence. This is what we are talking about. It cuts across race, class, black, white. These are current problems that needs to be addressed. Motherhood is an important aspect of the West African woman. Sterility, therefore, is a serious challenge because sterile women are stigmatized and treated with contempt no matter the status. Now, from West Africa, where I come from, female genital mutilation leads to sterility. And women that do not have children, I don't want to use the word sterility because I do not believe that any woman is sterile, they are stigmatized and treated with contempt. Stiwanist study. We are going to be looking at a particular book, this book, L'Obisterie de l'âme. L'Obisterie de l'âme, okay, I thought I had it. L'Obisterie de l'âme talks about a young lady who after 8 days she was mutilated. And after mutilation, they cut the clitoris. And after they cut the clitoris, she grew up, got married, only to discover that she couldn't have children. And that became a very serious problem for her because she's in a society where motherhood is considered as very important. But then, yesterday's sterile state did not stop her from achieving success. She studied French and German languages and became a protocol officer at the airport where she fought against bribery and corruption, even when she was called La femme qui ne peut pas avoir de l'enfant. Now let me explain that in French. La femme qui ne peut pas avoir de l'enfant is, as she passes along the road, people back at her, look at this one that cannot have children. But this problem came from the fact that she was sterilized according to the mandibles. Now, look at that, it said, les deux policiers disent à Yetunde qu'ils étaient venus la voir pour qu'elle leur donne leur part de l'argent qu'elle venait de recevoir du ministre des Finances. Now there, where there was bribery and corruption, people walked up to her and said, you must give us our share. And she says, no, I am not for this. Now, Yetunde, when she realized that she was sterile, she had to visit her parents, and they told her what led to the female genital mutilation. So what she did was, In Angra, she had a husband who was a policeman. She took the husband's gun without his knowledge, put it into her bag, traveled straight to the village looking for Brahima L'homme obisteri, the lamb. So when she got there, she did not see the man because the man had died. But he had two apprentices, Ali and Mamadou, and who were working with the man who was cutting people's clitoris. And then she decided to shoot at them. Now he said, il continua de travailler et de lutter contre les bandits. Okay, so that was the problem that was faced there. When she attempted to shoot at them, she was arrested and she was sent to jail. When she got to jail, which she was arrested for attempted murder. When she got to jail, what happened? In prison, she met Karim, a journalist, who was in prison for his writings. She narrated her ordeal, and instead of condemning her, Lamine encouraged her to be firm and told her that the password to survive in the prison was resistance. So she got to the prison simply because she tried to kill some people. And then she met with a journalist. They spoke, and he said, well, here, for you to survive and not die, it's that you have to have the word resistance. So she said, la résistance, c'est le mot passe ici. Voilà pourquoi on ne met pas quand on mange ici. So you have to be resistant. So it was Karim who helped her, instead of condemning the act of trying to kill people and say, well, you are here, but you don't have to die. If you are here, the word that you need here is resistance. Now, upon her release, she found out that her husband had married another wife. She was not sober. She picked up her things and left the house. Of course, something happened. It was a political problem, and then she was released. When she got back home, which is normal, well, for those of us in Francophone Africa, sorry to say, you don't have to make noise about the fact that your husband has brought in another wife. Once you are not there, well, you can just assume what could have happened. Please, off camera. Now, now she got home, and of course, the husband had married another wife. So she picked up her things, did not say a word, which we are talking about. You don't have to cry, you don't have to shout what has happened and happened. She had stayed in prison for a long time and decided to go back to her village. Now, when she got to her village, where she was sterilized, she started by working out things for the villagers. Now she said, yesterday decided to renovate the Catholic school at Madibu, where she admitted a lot of students and encouraged indigenous people to send their female children to school. She worked very hard and encouraged other teachers to do the same, and in no time the Catholic school became popular. Remember that when she was mutilated, it was the reverend, people were dying, children were dying, female children were dying from that problems of mutilation. Now, but in her own case, she was lucky. There was a reverend father who came to treat her. That was why she was able to survive the fact that she did not die at childhood. Eventually, when she got back, the Catholic father was no longer there. Now, this is what we talk about Stiwanism. What do we do to effect this change? What do we do to stop these practices? She decided, because the reverend fathers were no longer there, to renovate the Catholic school and encourage female children to go to school. Because over there, female children are, the boy child would go to school. The female child is not supposed to be, well, you know what that means. Apart from that, she also built a sports complex, bought some sporting equipment for the school, all to train children to become better and to make the village get better. All these things that she was able to do while she was in prison, because that particular prison was not mainly for people who committed crimes of maybe killing or shooting. There were people who fought against the practices in the government. So you had people in the government who were arrested, and they were all arrested together. Now, while she was in prison, she took all the writings. This one was arrested for this one was arrested for this, and then she started writing. That is how while she was in prison, she was still learning, and that's how she got all these ideas on how to make things better. Double back. Sorry, I want to go back. Yetunde initiated new techniques and methods of teaching, which she had learned at the prison for prisoners who studied in Europe and America. With this, a lot of students were also encouraged to study. So she had new tactics, she had new innovations, which she had to use in developing her society. Now, another thing is that Yetunde invited Ralifu, who she met at the prison, to construct 2 wells for students so that they can have potable water. The water was not pure, so people were dying. Now, I told you she met with several people while she was imprisoned. She called this man because everybody was released at the center and said, what can we do to provide potable water for our society so that people cannot be dying. And that is how they constructed a well where water can be pure. Now, it was after this incident that the indigenous people had water to drink. So before then, the people were not drinking good water. They were drinking water from the stream, which was leading to the death of people in the community. Not just that, Yetunde built a small pharmacy at the clinic with the help of Dr. Bello so that students can get free medication. People just fall sick, they die, they are not treated, they use whatever they do. So what she tried to do is, all this she collaborated, like I did, collaborating my supervisor, people from, that's what I did. The collaboration, she got everybody together, and that is how they were able to get a pharmacy. She discussed, now there was no electricity. When Yetunde came, she discussed the challenges of electricity with a top government official who she met at prison. Fortunately, he was from Madibu, and as a result, electricity was connected. So there was a connection of electricity. Now, after this, there was the issue of debt problems in the society. There was a lady called Aminata. Aminata succeeded in working with the white people, and then she was trained by Père Benoit. I told you that Père Benoit was the man who treated her while she was a young girl and she was mutilated. So she learned hygiene, she learned a lot, Aminata learned, and what they tried to do was to assemble village women and taught them lessons on hygiene. Children, men and women were no longer falling in because they had been sensitized to hygiene. And you see here, you said, les enfants ne tombaient plus aussi souvent malades que le passé, les femmes se portaient bien et leurs maris se sentaient bien. Now, les enfants ne tombaient plus malades, they no longer fell ill, like what was happening in the past. And that was because Yetunde succeeded in bringing out all these innovations. Now, apart from this, what she did was to sensitize women. Please permit me to do this. Where I come from, to a very large extent, the male children are given special preferences than the female children. So somehow as a woman, you are married when you are married and you have kids. So for you, just grow up, you do whatever you're supposed to do, just get married. It seems like fulfilled. So what she did was to organize programs for women and young girls where she sensitized them about the dangers of female genital mutilation, forced marriage, etc. Let me sing this song in Yoruba language. Where I come from, the female child sometimes, because they know they're already oppressed, they get withdrawn and they don't want to do some of the things. So you hear mothers singing songs like, Batami adu ko ka. Batami adu ko ka timba kawe mi. Batami adu ko ka. Let me explain. I'm sure you know what that. My shoes would make when I read my book. So it's encouraging female children who have succeeded. You know, you dress well, and when you're walking, you walk. So that's tick tock tock. That is ko ka. And so these songs are sung by mothers to encourage female children that if you want to succeed in life, if you want your shoes to do like mine is doing now, you need to study hard. Now she encouraged, apart from this, what she did was she was firm, she was assertive. She encouraged Anza and women of a particular age group to keep an eye on children and women. Husbands who were violent against their wives were publicly punished. Now remember that she came out from a very terrible past, if I'm allowed to use that word. What she did was to get a hunter, get women. Let us watch out for men who are violating and causing a lot of problems for their wives. And instead of punishing them secretly, they were punished openly so that they could serve as examples to the fact that women are objects and they should be treated properly. Yetunde brought a radical change at the school, at the clinic, and in the village. Yetunde avait apporté une transformation radicale au sein de l'école, à la clinique et dans tout le village. So it's not just at, within her zone. There was a transformation in the school, there was a transformation in the clinic, and everybody had the impact of this young girl who succeeded in taking up challenges. Now you have here domestic violence. I showed you the picture of what it looks like. Now, vie de femme, vie de sol. Let me explain what this is. When they say vie de femme, vie de sol. The life of a woman, a bloody life. Narrates the experience of Fatou and Bruce. Fatou falls in love with Bruce, became pregnant twice. She was betrayed several times by her partner who exploited her finances continually. Demonstrated marginalized masculinity, which later resulted into domestic violence. Fatou took a bold step after several threats to break the relationship against societal pressure, and later got married to Eric. Let me explain. Well, in the context where I come from, there are positions you cannot occupy if you are not married. You are considered as, you are not responsible enough. That's why it's a notion. It is assumed that you must have been able to manage your home properly before you can come out and manage the society. So somehow, some women, to go along with the societal trend, you get a man, he is your husband, whether you're married or not, and then you try so that you can gain this societal respect. Now, the issue, there are several other aspects of the book, but I just picked the very important one. Ambrose was a flirt. He had a number of girlfriends which posed a threat to Fatu's health. We all know that when a man goes from one place to another, you know the consequence of a sexually transmitted disease, and if the woman is, she could die. I don't want to use the word. Il sortait avec presque, let me say this in French, il sortait avec presque une demi-douzaine de filles à la fois et était devenu violent avec moi. Demi-douzaine, half a dozen of girls, and was also violent, you know, with her. So that's to tell you the rate at which the man was flirting. Ambrose was a thief. He was stealing Fatu's money while Fatu was accusing her son. Now, this man was not doing anything other than causing a lot of tension for the family. So the woman tried to have a small shop while she was selling some things, and what he goes is that when the woman is not around, he goes stealing from the woman's bag while the woman kept accusing the son of stealing. Meanwhile, it was the husband, in quote, who was the thief. Ambrose was violent. At every slight provocation, he beats up Fatu, especially when she refuses to give him money or stops him from using the car to hunt after other women. So anytime she tries to, like, you must stop this, it becomes a problem. Now, I'll read this in French. Je n'avais pas fini ma phrase. Un pluie de coups s'abattit sur moi. Je décidai de me défendre. Sorry. Résultat concluant, ils se retrouva avec Antonio Odambo et des griffes au corps. Je n'avais pas fini my phrases. I had not finished what I'm saying. Un pluie de coups. When the French says un pluie, it means rain of blows. That is what the man was doing to her. That's to tell you the extent with which she was violent. Now, in the light of Fatu's domestic violence, she took up a job with the Ministry of Education. All this did not make her to go into depression. She decided to be fair. What do I do now that I have this kind of man? So she decided to take up a job with the Ministry of Education. Fatu accepted the job. Not just that, after 2 children, she tried to keep herself in a good shape, and after giving birth to 2 sons. So she took up a job as a model. She took up it as a mannequin. Somebody who, a model. She goes as a star all over the place, and she was doing well for herself. She became a star and started flying out of the country to contest with international models. So she did not look at the challenges that was around her. She told herself, what do I do to myself to become better? So she packaged herself, and then at some point in her life, she became an international fellow. When Fatu could no longer cope with the situation at home, she and her friend Salima got the contact of a merchant abroad. She started selling imported cosmetics, which became profitable. So the man was not bringing everything in. There's an aspect of the book where he breaks everything he sees about the child. He hits, he does a lot of things. So it was causing, she brings the money, the man destroys. So at some point, it became so tough and she said, no, I can't continue like this. She got in contact, like I talked about, collaboration with another young lady, and they had the contact of another man, which was helping them to import cosmetics from another country, and this business became profitable. Fatu's sister Bali came back from trip abroad, heard of all the violent actions, and God decided to put an end to the relationship against societal pressure. Now the sister came back and saw all this. What do? Do we leave our sister? Because this could actually lead to death. So they said, if you cannot take the decision, we'll take a decision for you. This would stop. Now, she still tried to see how she can make up the relationship. Like I said, you need to keep this man for societal reasons. But after that, she said, okay, I can no longer take this. She took a bold step. She broke the relationship and got married. She was in courtship with Eric. The marriage was contracted officially, and she lived happily ever. Now, conclusively, it is very important that the female child is educated at grassroots level to bring about positive change. Literary scholars should endeavor to sensitize and educate women at all levels to be empowered, beginning from the home. Traditional practices that pose any form of threat So the lives and destinies should be eradicated. The woman should develop herself in order to avoid exploitation. Stiwanism, as portrayed in the novels, had a great impact on transforming the society. Men and women should work together to bring about transformation in the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joy. Our next speaker is Brendon Nicholls, and he's all the way from the University of Leeds, in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Brendon.
I'm Brendon Nicholls. Today's paper is something of a beginning for me in thinking about three womanist texts, Chikwenye Okonjo Ogunyemi's early essay, Alice Walker's essay In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, and to a lesser extent, Honora Hudson-Weems's book on Africana womanism. I'll tell you what led me into thinking around these three figures, and I think the time frame is something like their earliest work, 1984, 1985, 1986. It very much is first steps. I've become increasingly dissatisfied with what universities are, the work they do, the forms of work that they accord the status of theory. And it seems to me that one of the first democratizing moves is to insist that theory happens in places outside of university walls, that it happens within the popular cultural, that it happens on our streets, in our communities, wherever they happen to be. And so I started thinking along those lines by looking at the work of Houston A. Baker on the blues, in which he sets out his kind of, I guess, change in his academic biography and his move towards vernacular theory. And I've accompanied that with a kind of really badly photocopied picture that I think he has half in mind, something like this. He writes, I found myself confronted with a figure-to-ground reversal. A fitting image for the effect of my reorientation is the gestalt illustration of a Greek hydria, a water vase with curved handles, that transforms itself into two faces in profile. John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, with its familiar detailing of the economies of art and human emotion, can be considered one moment in the shift. Contrasting with Keats's romantic figures are the emergent faces of a venerable ancestry. The shift from Greek hydrias to ancestral faces is a shift from high art to vernacular expression. Now, the first thing to say is that Baker's taking a couple of poetic liberties with the Greek hydria and Keats's Ode on the Grecian Urn. In actual fact, if that is the sort of image he has in mind, the vase framed by two ancestral faces, he's thinking perhaps of the Rubens vase that is familiar from many psychology primers. And yet, I wouldn't want to kind of allocate a mistake of fact to him. Instead, what I think he's doing is making a kind of tropological shift between figures in a strategic way. In other words, moving from figure to figure to figure. Hydria, Grecian urn, in other words, literary canonical artifacts, onto the Rubens vase, which enables in that enfolding kind of positioning of the ancestors. So vernacular theory, at least in Baker's treatment, is radically democratic and participatory. It refuses Eurocentric primacy. A vernacular theory enfolds the literary canon with the restorative human faces of African ancestors. That productively conflictual and transforming embrace is something that I also see in the work, the womanist work of Alice Walker, Chikwenye Okonjo Ogunyemi, and Honora Hudson-Weems. My paper includes the companion theorist Melanie Klein and her psychoanalytic theory of object relations. Object relations are critically suggestive. because they underscore the purposefulness of our scholarly choices. The purposeful choice is often a politics, not least because our academic personae rely so often upon genealogies of selection. Melanie Klein allows us to think about how object choices inaugurate political modes, such as opposition or integration, in our earliest psychic life. For Klein, the infant moves through two stages. The first stage is the schizoid position. I was going to do a diagram, but unfortunately ran out of time. So I'll kind of like model it, why not? Come to Rhodes and try and do a dance with poor motor coordination. So schizoid position and the depressive position, which is the more mature one. And then the schizoid position breaks down into two forms of identification: introjective, there, and projective, there. And introjective breaks down into two dispositions towards the breast: good breast, bad breast, and I think we're just about there. So the first stage is the schizoid position, which is itself founded upon two successive identifications. You can see why I had to model it. Introjective identification and projective identification. In introjective identification, the infant's relation to the mother's breast is twofold. The breast, a part object, is split. The infant fantasizes a good breast, which nurtures and fulfills the self. This good breast is then internalized or introjected as a positive ideal. The second negative ideal is of a bad, persecutory, frustratingly withheld breast. This bad breast is something that the infant fantasizes about biting, chewing, shredding, or destroying. The infant then internalizes or introjects this bad breast partially in its hallucinated fragments. Within the schizoid position, a second mode accompanies introjective identification. And that second mode in the schizoid position is projective identification. Prompted by expulsive anal and urethral impulses or drives, we identify with others by placing upon them parts of ourselves that we do not want. Identification here is not something held onto, but something once rejected, relinquished to others, and then re-imported retroactively to construct ideals of self. Now, these basic schizoid positions can be surmounted by a more mature phase. That more mature development takes place when the infant apprehends the mother as a whole, as more than the sum of her good or bad parts, if you like, or as more than the sum of her part objects. To accomplish that, the infant must allow love or libido to triumph over hate or aggression towards the object. To sustain the mother as a whole, object therefore, the infant must also sustain ambivalence and must feel the need to mitigate aggression towards the mother. But otherwise, the infant must make reparation to the object for the aggression to which they have submitted her. This is what Klein calls a depressive position. If Klein is right that any identity is founded upon splitting, then that might alert us to ambivalence as being key to any larger political identity project. Ambivalence, I argue, is a key critical method within womanist discourse. I'm very drawn to the interplay of mother and daughter figures in womanism and to its matrilinear orientation. But there's a paradox that interests me. The three womanist critics I've focused on tend not to wholly acknowledge their critical mother figures. For instance, Chikwenye Okonjo Oguniemi writes, and I've put this on the handout, I arrived at the term womanism independently and was pleasantly surprised to discover that my notion of its meaning overlaps with Alice Walker's. She employs it to denote the metamorphosis that occurs in an adolescent girl, such as Ruth or Celia, I think there's a mistake on the handout, sorry, when she comes to a sense of herself as a woman. The young girl inherits womanism after a traumatic event such as the menarche at the onset of menstruation, or after an epiphany, or as a result of the experience of racism, rape, death in the family, or sudden responsibility. Womanism's aim is the dynamism of wholeness and self-healing that one sees in the positive integrative endings of womanist novels. So despite the mention of the menarche and its subtle allusion to Walker's furtive double entendre in that frontispiece, those definitions at the beginning of In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, the book, where she writes, the womanist is not a separatist except periodically for health. There is what I call a quandary of origin in Oguniemi's essay. Walker, we know, published In Search of Our Mother's Gardens in 1984. Oguniemi published Womanism, the Dynamics of the Contemporary Black Female Novel in English in Science in 1985. And repeating that pattern, if it's there, of downplaying Walker's influence, Kenora Hudson Weems follows on with her book on Afrikaner womanism. This is number 3 on the handout. She states that womanism is a concept I named and defined in the mid-80s, then called Black womanism. And she continues, even Alice Walker's womanism pronouncements, literally a page and 1/2, but what a page and 1/2, does little more than present a brief commentary between what Collins notes as alternately called womanism and black feminism, purple versus lavender. There's a fault line here, perhaps, and perhaps it continues through all 3 writers. Hudson Weems's womanism asserts ancestry only to deny inheritance. So while womanism is in Walker's term committed to the survival and wholeness of entire people, womanist discourse, at least in this early phase, itself is marked by partial states of origination and arrested moments of development. It is almost as if every epiphanic contribution or intervention by Walker, by Ogoniemi, by Hudson Weems, resets the terrain from which womanism speaks. We have here something like the young girl's inheritance of the traumatic event in Ogoniemi's framework, even as womanism itself proceeds through multiple staggered iterations. So I'm thinking of womanism not as a lineage, but as a series of productive and creative ruptures, each of which refreshes and complicates the field. As a discourse within history, womanism develops in much the same way as its daughters become womanish, in Walker's terms, through key moments of epiphanic discursive arrest. Each womanist writer, we might say, presents a new rite of passage within the larger maturation of the discourse. The trouble perhaps in this model is that the critical claim to firstness risks supplanting the position of mother and artist, both of which are defined by acts of origination. I can't resolve that tangle. It doesn't fall to me to adjudicate it, I would insist, but I want to inhabit it and kind of go with it for the rest of my paper. Ogoniemi and Hudson Weems offer seeming departures from Walker, and even possibly, in Hudson Weems's case, direct friendly fire towards her. But this only repeats a move that Walker herself has made in relation to her own precursor, Phyllis Wheatley. Look at what Walker writes. She says, for when, and this is on the handout, we read the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley, evidence of contrary instincts is everywhere, her loyalties were completely divided, as was, without question, her mind. But at last, Phyllis, we understand. No more snickering when your stiff, struggling, ambivalent lines are forced on us. Forced on us. It is not so much what you sang, as that you kept alive in so many of our ancestors the notion of song. This remarkable passage denies the mother poet her song, her mind, and even her voice. It is marked perhaps by a kind of dismissive accommodation. Wheatley's poetry, Walker writes, is forced on us, demarcating something exceptional, something that is not instantly part of the readerly community, something that is accepted only once its imposition has been mitigated. While Walker says of her mothers and grandmothers that they were creators, because they were so rich in spirituality, again it's on the handout, which is the basis of art, and when she adds later that our grandmothers knew without even knowing the reality of their spirituality, this is perhaps a spirituality that she wants paradoxically and oddly to deny Phyllis Wheatley. There's a famous passage in which Walker takes Wheatley to task for her description of the goddess, and again I put it on the handout, as she poetically called the liberty she did not have. And the section from the poem goes, the goddess comes, she moves divinely fair, olive and laurel binds her golden hair. Wherever shines this native of the skies, unnumbered charms and recent graces rise. It is obvious, comments Walker, that Phyllis the slave combed the goddess's hair every morning, prior perhaps to bringing in the milk, or fixing her mistress' lunch. I have a lot of sympathy with Walker's politicized reading. I think it's deliberately provocative and productive. So the poem, which I went and read, is kind of atrocious. It's about America as Colombia, kind of overcoming all sorts of geopolitical obstacles and wars with other nations. But Walker's obvious reading, in her phrase, is also capable of being read in less obvious ways. What does it mean that Walker, the daughter poet, projects onto Wheatley, the mother poet, the claim of tending to another girl or woman? And to take things further, if I may ask a very cheeky Kleinian question, what are milk and nourishment specifically doing in this scene? Is Wheatley a mother poet or a bad breast, a part object in this moment? Tending, delivering milk, making food may be tasks that a slave servant might have undertaken in the 18th century. Writing poetry most certainly was not. But the tending, delivering milk, and making food are not to be found in the text of the poem. Walker has projected something obvious in her term onto the poem that is precisely not obvious in it. I want to make the case for a less obvious reading of Wheatley. I tried looking at the Columbia poem and decided that that was a task too great to try to undertake, so I turned towards a poem Wheatley wrote on being transported as a child from Africa to America. And it's on your handout again, and it goes, at first reading, it's an uncomfortable read. "'Twas mercy," she says, "that brought me from my pagan land," I assume she means Africa, the west coast of it, "taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God and there's a Saviour too. Once our redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their colour is a diabolic dye. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." So an orthodox reading of the poem is that Wheatley is grateful to slavery for giving her the gift of Christian redemption, which looks like a stunning own goal. And yet, I think we might, if we adopted that reading, miss the far more important ambivalence that Wheatley is building into her poem. Ambivalence towards which Walker's own groundbreaking essay actually directs and guides us. This is a poem that speaks to a double scene, that produces a ghosted movement. The poem is published in the very same year, 1773, that Wheatley herself moved from the United States to the United Kingdom, an unexpected journey, of course, completing one leg of the Atlantic slave trade, but with an unintended destination, which is to try to become a poet, which she does eventually, a published poet. It is also an anticipation of her own imminent Atlantic passage to the United Kingdom that I think sort of haunts this other journey that she's speaking about. And I think we can see that movement condensed in the poem's metonymies and homophones. The diabolical dye, whose colour belongs to the black race, is not the stain of sin, it's not the stain of race, I don't think, but instead quite possibly alludes to the product of indigo that formed part of the slave trade. British demand for this dye was increasing exactly at the time the poem was written. Why is it increasing? They're buying their indigo at first from the French. They have a trade war with the French. They don't want to prop up the French economy. There's an indigenous version of indigo that grows in the Americas, and they're trying to put pressure on the colonists in the New World to start growing indigo to import back into the UK. So here, colour of the product of indigo belongs to the slave, not the trader. Their colour is diabolic dye. What is diabolical is sometimes fatal conditions under which the dye is produced. The plantation becomes politicized in Wheatley's deft and ambivalent lines, so that race reduces to the explosive economics of slavery, so that race as colour does not precede the production of indigo, but in fact emerges from it. What is also astounding is the seemingly self-loathing final couplet that begins to slide. Christians and Negroes are not necessarily separable as phrased. Remember Christians who are Negroes, or remember Christians, Negroes. So they can't be syntactically disaggregated. The reader addressed may be Christians, or maybe a latent Jew being asked to behold Christians who happen to be African American. Moreover, if we follow the lineage of slave production that I've tried to make a case for in relation to indigo, and in fact there's a critic called Susan Martin who's made this case far better than I ever could, I discovered after writing the paper. The Negro's black as Cain, Abel's murderous brother, may also point directly towards the corrupt trade in cane sugar, burnt or blackened for extraction, and then refined not in the colonies, but produced refined in the United Kingdom in Whitechapel's in London's East End, and the process is a bit like apparently making consomme. You kind of froth up egg whites, and that filters out impurities in the sugar and refines it sort of halfway towards what we might have in our modern refined sugar. So perhaps most stunningly in the poem, there's a half a suggestion that the cost of Christians forgetting about black refinement is slave revolution. What sin stained Cain? Well, murdering his brother Abel. If Cain the murderer is black in the metaphor, is Abel the victim morally and therefore racially white? What would be the consequence of Christians not remembering that Negroes, in Wheatley's term, may be refined, Perhaps the consequence might be that Cain the murderer remains a murderer. Perhaps, in other words, African Americans may refuse the civil and racist terms of refinement and might resort to fratricidal revolutionary combat. There's a kind of half threat, I think, in those lines if they're taken to their logical conclusion. In other words, African Americans may learn from the murderous biblical example of Cain in whatever way might suit their redemptive angelic rise. But Wheatley's subtlety points to further reading. Cain asks the question that the slaveholder does not ask: am I my brother's keeper? The mark of Cain is given by God so that Cain will be protected, no man will kill him. So in that reading, revolution is biblically exonerated. Wheatley plays with racist stereotype only to completely subvert it with her deep and studied learning. She's not reinforcing Judeo-Christian whiteness, she's utterly collapsing it. And she's accomplishing something like Houston A. Baker's figure-to-ground reversal with the biblical text and surrounding it with the human face of slave production, I think, maybe, at a push. I think that Walker's critical reading of Wheatley is strategic. Her essays deliberately poise between the developmental and the regressive. In Search of My Mother's Garden, I found my own, she writes. Walker, in other words, is poised between artistic and womanly individuation and the claims of intergenerational obligation. We tend to think of ambivalence as politically indecisive or unfocused, but I would argue that this ambivalence is precisely what allows womanist thinkers to sustain multivalent forms of relation to vernacular culture, to feminism, and to intergenerational obligation. The promise of such ambivalence is that it can sustain broad coalitions without compromising the very political interests or stakes that they contain. I would go further and say that ambivalence constitutes a pragmatic way of managing intersectional complexities. Walker, Oguniemi, and Hudson Weems all advance the poetics of ambivalence in their different ways. Womanism's embrace of its object is productively conflictual. It transforms what it accommodates by using figurative flexibility. In other words, Oguniemi's line about the womanist as childless mother, or Walker's phrase, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender, so we've got a degree in difference, not in kind, but also, of course, we've got a kind of synesthetic move from colour to fragrance in lavender. And womanism thereby reconstitutes community on non-racist, non-sexist, and non-homophobic lines. Thanks.
Thank you, Brendon. Thanks. We will have time for questions after the third speaker. Our last speaker is Manthipe Moila. And the topic of her paper is the re-articulation of a holistic African female subjectivity in Koleka Putuma's collective amnesia. She's also from the university that's currently known as Rhodes.
Hi everyone. In her poem Graduation, South African poet Koleka Putuma writes, "Unlearning is not a real place or destination," to illustrate that unlearning is an unending intellectual process, a journey without a terminus. A few lines later, the speaker of the poem realizes that perhaps unlearning should be a place, and all the women in your family should gather there more often, until unlearning is a tradition you pass on to your children, until you know how to hold each other. Through this metaphor, unlearning extends beyond the individual mind into the realm of relationships that play themselves out in physical spaces. It comes to denote a gathering where women aid each other in transforming how they see the world, how they see themselves, and how they relate to one another. Arguably, the process of re-articulation, as defined by Patricia Hill Collins, is a variation of the unlearning that Putuma writes about. Hill Collins uses re-articulation to denote a process of self-definition which alters the way in which Black women see themselves. Re-articulation entails taking the core themes of a Black woman's standpoint and infusing them with new ideas, thereby stimulating a new consciousness that utilizes Black women's everyday taken for granted knowledge. I will argue that Putuma, through her poetry collection, Collective Amnesia, published in 2017 by UCKAR, finds ways of re-articulating black female subjectivity. Putuma does so by complicating the black women's standpoint and infusing lesbian sexuality into it, by exploring the interplay between the personal and the political without privileging one over another, and by excavating the silences in both. Disruptive, Putuma's collective amnesia arrives after the eruption of the Fees Must Fall student movement and the naked protest of 2016. This presentation includes the above contextualization, a brief elaboration on the conceptual framework, and a close reading of the poem No Easter Sunday for Queers. The presentation closes with a brief exploration of the relationship between collective amnesia and silence. Onto the conceptual framework. Pinpointing a singular feminist conceptual framework is difficult because there is a myriad of feminist ideologies that have differing focal points. To speak of a feminism that seeks to eradicate patriarchy, which is defined as social and other frameworks that enable the exploitation of women by men and thereby cement men's economic, social, and political power, is to speak of a feminism that faces much opposition. One core issue is that feminism that has patriarchy as its sole concern often overlooks other paradigms of oppression, such as systematic and institutional racism, pervasive heterosexism, exploitative economic systems, and so on. Black or African feminists operate with an ideological framework that aspires to capture the complexity of the oppression that they are subjected to. That being said, they do not have a homogeneous set of ideals. Black or African feminisms manifest themselves in a variety of ways: womanism, Afrikaner womanism, Negro-feminism, Stiwanism. Despite these variations, the project of Black or African feminists worldwide has been to elucidate that they're subject to multiple, interlocking but disparate systems of oppression. As a result, one core element of Black or African feminisms, whatever their dissimilarities, is intersectionality. Coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, the term intersectionality refers to particular points of intersecting oppressions, for example, intersections of race and gender, or of sexuality and nation. Intersectional paradigms remind us that oppression cannot be reduced to one fundamental type, and that oppressions work together in producing injustice. Be that as it may, Black or African feminisms have arguably failed in the extent to which they fully encompass intersectionality. According to Lynn Osome, African feminists are guilty of a particular identity politics that, in normalizing heterosexuality, excludes certain subjects in the name of representation. Thus, even the acknowledgement of the intersection between gender and race does not fully explore the multiplicity of Black female subjectivity. In collective amnesia, the aspects of Black female subjectivity which have thus far been veiled are uncloaked. Without referring directly to sexuality, Nero Yuval Davis offers a possible explanation for the veiling of lesbian sexuality within Black African feminisms. She argues that when Black, women, and working class are ossified as sites of repression in additive ways, this leads to the creation of hegemonic discourses of identity politics that render invisible experiences of more marginal members of a specific social category and construct a homogenized right way to be its member. Ironically, this is exactly the reason Black women and members of other marginalized groupings felt the need for what is known today as an intersectional analysis. Except in such constructions, what takes place is actually fragmentation and multiplication of wider categorical identities rather than more dynamic, shifting, and multiplex constructions of intersectionality. I will utilize insights from Black feminists with this caveat in mind. In fact, throughout collective amnesia, Putuma repudiates the notion that Black women is an uncomplicated, static, or ossified side of oppression, thereby re-articulating Black female subjectivity. Similarly, and more relevant to No Easter Sunday for Queers, which is the poem that I will be discussing, Putuma utilizes an outsider within standpoint as articulated by Hill Collins. This is a standpoint available to Black lesbians, which illustrates that intersection oppressions of sexuality, race, gender, and class produce neither absolute oppressors or pure victims. Moving on to the poem No Easter Sunday for Queers. This poem traces the disquieting ruminations of a Black lesbian woman who is listening to her father give a sermon. The poem discusses the larger societal forces which erase, constrict, and enable the potential violation of the speaker as a Black lesbian woman. It is ultimately a poem about how these forces influence an intimate relationship between father and daughter, and is at last directed at the speaker's father. Illustrating the outsider-within standpoint, the speaker shows that homophobia, patriarchy, and religion collude with one another to render her lived experience as a black lesbian woman a fraught one. Furthermore, all three congeal to lodge the equivalent of a thick wall between father and daughter. The poem begins with the speaker's introspection on the disparate northern and southern suburbs, which are respectively Belleville and Rondebosch, located in the Western Cape. With a disenchanted tone, the speaker notes that despite their differences, both sides demand that she succumb to the forces that shape the dynamics of each space. The northern suburb is where she must uphold Christian values which she no longer values. As a pastor's daughter who loves a Muslim woman, she must disguise both her religious conversion and her sexuality. For the speaker, the word is gospel. The word is a prison, is a cell without bars. In this metaphorical comparison, the word is analogous to a prison. Lesbian women are restricted, just as one who's in a prison cell is restricted. Their self-expression is mediated by social norms that seek to repress their sexuality. Even Islam, the speaker's chosen faith, is a prayer mat that sibs her mouth. It's a prayer mat that sibs her mouth and wears out her knees. She's always in this position, begging for something. This line is significant as, in the end, the poem reads like a plea for recognition. That being said, the speaker does not seek recognition from a stable subject position. She oscillates between using pronouns that distance her from those who are vilified by the church, and pronouns that affirm her affinity with them. This is evident in the lines, how we tell no one, and ask no one to help us carry a cross that crosses us out. The words they and us appear on the page, but they have a line running through them, indicating that they have been crossed out. By crossing out words, Putuma ensures that the speaker's inner conflict leaves an imprint on the page, creating a palimpsest of doubt. This technique makes apparent the extent to which erasure and self-censor are psychologically confounding. Not only that, but the word cross conjures the cross that Jesus carried preceding his crucifixion, and to which he was nailed. As will be shown, Putuma associates the violence of the crucifixion with violence perpetrated against queer people. This violence is, in part, as a result of religious doctrines that assert the deviancy of sexualities other than heterosexuality. Similarly, making a link between sexuality and deviancy, as imposed by racist and patriarchal discourses, Kabiba Badaroan asserts that black bodies in South Africa have been imbued with unsettling sexualized meanings. Black female bodies, in particular, have been portrayed through patterns of hypervisibility, which have simultaneously subjected women to heightened levels of surveillance, and rendered invisible the systematic violence to which they have been subjected. Putuma, through her outsider-in standpoint, complicates this observation by adding the dimension of lesbian sexuality. The poem goes on to show the paradoxical positioning of lesbian women. When not invisible, they are made hypervisible through the media, which only acknowledges them in relation to violence, the underpinnings of which often remain unseen. Once the poem stops oscillating between the north and south, the speaker reveals that she's firmly located in the north in a church sermon. From that point on, a grotesque and violent phantasmagoria of the happenings in the church is coupled with harrowing images of violence enacted against lesbian women and women in general, all of which creates an atmosphere of alarm. The speaker asks, why is it that there is no Easter Sunday for queer bodies when lesbians are crucified like Christ? Using the simile, the speaker likens queer South Africans to Jesus. Both are unjustly prosecuted and pay for their perceived transgressions with their lives or through some form of brutality visited upon their bodies. In an extended metaphor, Putuma reveals that despite the similarities between the prosecutor group and Jesus, Jesus is revered and resurrected after his death. Queer people, on the other hand, continue to be reviled by society and Jesus himself. They are only resurrected as a headline, only known in terms of violence or death. Beneath the speaker's anger towards the media and to toxic religious doctrines, there is a desperate need to be recognized by her father. The lines, I am holding on to my Father, our Father, my Father, our Father who art in heaven, who art in my conditioning, pivots the poem from being a contemplation of violence against queer people to being an appeal for validation. Petty accusations are leveled at the speaker's father, the stranger on the pulpit. The speaker contemplates how her father would preach about her if she were to fall prey to the violence perpetrated against queer people. She asks, would he preach about me with the same passion he preaches about the death of a white man he has never met, raised? Here, the word met is crossed out. In the first few stanzas, the crossing out of words conveys the erasure and self-censor of queer people. In these lines, it highlights the absurdity of the homophobia that stifles a relationship between a preacher and his daughter. It is more likely that he would preach kindly for a man he has never met, the white indicating the extent of the remoteness between the men, than for his own child. It seems that the disjuncture between father and daughter is lodged there by society and kept in place by both the father and the father. The desperation for recognition is punctuated by the last two lines of the poem. Daddy, would you even preach at all? The shift from father to daddy indicates vulnerability, as daddy connotes closeness as well as unguardedness. Despite recourse to this term, it seems that the speaker harbors some veiled anger towards her father, and the term daddy works to highlight the extent of the betrayal she anticipates. She conjectures about whether her father would call her murderers Pharisees, cowards, or servants of God. What heightens the tragedy about the distance between father and daughter is the extent of the daughter's uncertainty. Seemingly unshrinking, Putuma makes a stunning comparison between Jesus and brutalized queer people. It is a seemingly unshrinking bravery that characterizes the poem, as the speaker is also sensitive to her precarious position as a black lesbian woman in a country where violence against women and violence against queer people is pervasive. In the poem, fear blends with bravado. The condemnation of homophobia is followed by a plea rather than a demand for recognition. The speaker navigates thorny terrain. It seems that she has a desire to restore a relationship with her father, who art in her conditioning, rather than to forsake him, even as she anticipates and fears that he might forsake her. It is a complex poem. Both protest and entreaty are housed in it. It is as if the poem itself, like the speaker, holds two lives in one body. Where this sinks the speaker, it elevates the poem, making it a poignant rendition of both vulnerability and defiance. Through an outsider-within standpoint, a standpoint that infuses lesbian sexuality into black female subjectivity, Putuma forces the women who gather together in the place of unlearning to recognize the disparities within, and thereby re-articulates black female subjectivity. Moving on to my conclusion. Stanley Cohen defines social amnesia as a mode of forgetting by which a society separates itself from its discreditable past record. One way that social amnesia manifests itself is through a process of slippage in which uncomfortable knowledge is repressed. At this stage, Cohen poses a variety of questions about this type of social amnesia. If we shut something out of knowledge, is this done consciously or unconsciously? Under what conditions, for example, information overload or desensitization, is such denial likely to take place? Koleka Putuma's collective amnesia offers a continued elaboration on social amnesia and answers some of Cohen's questions. In an interview with 10 and 5, Putuma explains that when we look at the country, but not only the country, in our families as well, we kind of realize that when you don't grieve or when you don't heal from something, collectively, as a group, or as people, things come back. There's a cycle, right? And even if you try to slip into a kind of amnesia, if you have not dealt with something in one way or another, it's going to return. Putuma's notion of collective amnesia is therefore a kind of social amnesia that, unlike Cohen's, transverses the personal and political and is specific to South Africa. Collective amnesia is a constant repression of that which needs to be acknowledged, that which demands grieving and cannot otherwise be healed. It happens consciously rather than unconsciously, it occurs not to desensitize, but to sanitize. In part, Putuma shows this by exploring the relationship between silence and collective amnesia. Collective amnesia, the poetry collection as a whole, encompasses a similar attitude towards silence that Audre Lorde articulates in her speech entitled The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. Lorde asks, what are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you will sicken and die from them, still in silence? Putuma answers, erasure. Harmful, racist, patriarchal, religious, and heteronormative discourses. Repressed grief, stifled mourning, depression, violence. For Lorde, people seek refuge in silence because they fear the visibility without which they cannot truly live. Aware of the importance of self-definition, Putuma aggressively pursues visibility through collective amnesia. In Lifeline, Putuma lists Black women from around the globe, scholars, writers, and artists, many of whom have been mentioned in the longer version of this essay. For example, Cranshaw, Lorde, Tlali, Ola, Manthipe, Mashile, Baba, Dangaremba, and Ndlovu. In the poem, the speaker states that this is not a poem, it is a lifeline. Every name is a gospel shut up in my bones. Every name chants, Black girl, live, live, live. Similarly, collective amnesia seeks to act as a lifeline for, as Lorde puts it, those of us who stand outside the circle of the society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucible of difference. Collective amnesia tries to gather these women to the place of unlearning, until unlearning, rather than silence, is what their children will come to inherit. Putuma explores the complexity of Black female subjectivity, rejecting the hegemonic position of straight women, and instead re-articulates a new Black female subjectivity, which is bold, queer, visible, and voiced. Thank you.
I'm sure you'll join me in thanking our speakers for their excellent presentations and for keeping so well within the time that was allocated. We have now enough time for questions and comments and for discussion before we go to lunch. So could we give them a round of applause again? I thought we should take 3 questions at a time, and you can address them to individual speakers or collectively, or one may want to comment on the other. So you're welcome to make your comments and questions. I should like to start by picking on a comment that Brendon made. Am I my brother's keeper? So, am I my brother's sister's keeper? And I wanted to ask whether you, Joy, in terms of social transformation, Brendon, ambivalence, and you, Manthipe, whether your theme of negotiation and erasure, how does one use those themes in relation to this trope of am I my brother's sister's keeper, the way in which it reflects to self and to other, and even where self is the other. And if you want to just ponder over that. 2 more questions for this round. That makes sense.
I think it's quite interesting that in all 3 presentations there is a theme of Judeo-Christian discourse ran through. You all touched on it. I don't want to open up a discussion about colonialism and Christianity, but I find it interesting that the discourses are so prevalent and so influential today. Even someone like Koleka Putuma finds herself grappling with it at that very visceral level. I think it's just worth noting.
It's a
legacy.
Very good question, and it is a kind of subtext I thought of that too. Thank you. Maybe we can discuss that. And but to also show how it connects with other faith traditions.
Yes.
Okay, this question comes in three parts, for which I apologize profusely, but otherwise I'm just going to forget. And it is for Manthipe. So, first of all, in discussing the kind of ossification of discourse that you mentioned, particularly along like racialized and gendered lines, I want to ask if you think that if you would agree that ossification is a sort of inevitable result of any instance in which identities are taken from the realm of the social construct and instead placed as a kind of impractical part of being, in much the same way that a sort of metaphysical reading of the Christian reference would see Christ in being crucified as having to sort of transcend the body, that is the intractable identity that he then needs to surpass. The second part then is, in light of that, is it perhaps then that Putuma's ambivalence over trying to negotiate those identities comes out of the fact that of taking those socially constructed roles and making them and dealing with the fact that they are made to be inherent to people, and that is a sort of imposition that can't actually be negotiated by the individual on that level, and therefore part three, the reason she then has to appeal in that particular poem to the father, but in a more general sense to the holders of societal authority that necessarily confirm social roles for people, and thus can be seen, if you agree with part one, to dictate the identities that people are allowed to take on, and thus the ways in which they can negotiate and interrogate the world they live in.
Thank you. So we'll go around now, and then we'll open.
So there's a paper where Judith Butler talks about women and agency, and she talks about the problem of the term women within feminist discourse. Sorry, Adam, I can't see you, but I'm talking to you. And she talks about how the term women needs to become kind of open, and it needs to have multiple significations. And in terms of looking at identity as inherent, the question, I think what Putuma tries to do is tries to widen the scope more so than trying to completely escape the imposition of inherent kind of identities. So for example, she uses women X as opposed to women with an A or women with an E as a way to kind of displace, for example, the idea of woman what it is, because it's supposed to be more inclusive. And I think that when it comes to identities, especially almost like ready-made, you know, I think that there's always going to be a certain level of, there's always going to be boundaries which people then have to push against in order to feel as though, first of all, a variety of identities are being validated, and secondly, not to feel so trapped, you know, by impositions based on societal and other discourses. Because one thing that Judith Butler says is that the term women, for example, within feminist discourse, or any term that's based on kind of identities, is not just descriptive but normative. So I think what Putuma tries to do with the collection is looking at what kind of essentialist ontologies are within that and trying to blow it open a little bit more, you know. And I honestly think that that's always going to be the struggle, you know, trying to push against whatever boundaries exist. And maybe that even ties into her notion of unlearning, which she repeats quite a bit within collection, unlearning as a way of constantly questioning kind of things that seem naturalized, things that seem normative, things that are normal. So yeah, I think that's the best way that I can answer all three of your questions without lying.
Wow, thank you very much. I'll try not to be very formal because this is discussion time. Just try to tolerate me. Now, she's answered part of the question I don't want to repeat. She asked a question. She said, are you Joy Joseph in terms of social transformation? Let me call our attention to the fact that we're dealing with scholarly activities here. So I'll start by saying that I am Joy Joseph collaborating with other male and female scholars, sensitizing them. That's why you see that I succeeded in bringing like 4 men for this, colloquium, so that they could hear and say it's not just that a woman has to be a Stiwanist. A man can also be a Stiwanist. And I was speaking with this participant. I said, this is great to see a male scholar talking about womanism. So in that light, I've succeeded in bringing everybody come together. Let's see how we can work as a team. Now, I am Joy Joseph sensitizing other scholars. That's why I'm here in this colloquium. That's why I looked for something completely different. What is Stiwanism? Social transformation, including women of Africa. So that is why I'm sensitizing all of us. So we start from here, and then we see how we could move out to the society. I am Joy Joseph in Rhodes University, coming up with new theories, new technologies, reading this big book here, recreating ourselves. What is new? What are we saying that other people have not said? Finally, I am Joy Joseph as a female lecturer. I work in the university in Nigeria. What I tried to do was, there's a problem of masculinity. For some people who would look at me, they would see a masculine trait, and so you are stigmatized. So what I try to do is try to build girls. I play football. And
Can I pick up on the Judeo-Christian question first of all? I don't think it answers your question, but one of the lines that I had thought of following in the paper around the poem that of Weeklies that is included in Walker's essay was to think about recent graces, not in terms of Christian grace, but in terms of her reading around Roman graces. And I almost wanted to argue that she was assembling, presumably ancient charms, recent graces, rise to accompany the goddess, not God, in the sky. So almost assembling a pantheon of different faiths in the poem. Then I read the whole poem and didn't feel so safe going there, so I cut the passage out of back to the drawing board. In relation to the question, am I my brother's sister's keeper? And it's a very, very good question. I think all discourse is proprietorial, but many of us exercise our freedoms some of our freedoms through reading. And I think that if something is out there, it deserves to be read with the seriousness that with which it was published. And so it's an ambivalent and paradoxical response, but I hope it gets somewhere towards answering the question.
And if I might just add to Sam's question, the methodology of questioning, and I'd like to draw on Manthipe's grammar of interrupting, of displacing, of questioning, which we bring to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and I speak from that tradition, is something we can share across the sacred spaces. And we must do that, and that is our responsibility across all the received traditions and the doctrinaire thinkings that we inherit. And that is the role of the way in which the sacred can in some ways be reconstituted. And it's actually a very powerful endeavor. So yes, it comes from a certain historical trajectory, the Judeo-Christian tradition, but the methodologies of questioning anything that's doctrinaire and received. And the whole notion of what is belief, the role of the imagination is crucial across faith traditions, and I think we could learn from that. And much of the work we're doing and the scholarship that we're doing does this. I was talking at tea, but if you read J.M. Coetzee's The Childhood of Jesus, it's an excellent example of that. We could continue. Yes. Right, Sipakazi.
I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment, and I'm not sure who I'm directing it
It's
to.
fine. And we
So I'll
can all
just kind of throw it out there, and wherever
Yes.
it lands, you can take it. I'm wondering about how not only African feminisms or this space actually might respond to the question of decolonization in an ideal world, what that might look like. I was really intrigued by the presentation, Joy. It brought me lots of said joy because of the way in which you integrated, and I think the question of collaboration came up more than once. The integration of more than one language, drawing on other forms such as song, ritual, so drawing on existing so-called indigenous knowledge systems to put your presentation together. And for me, even that was an example of Stiwanism. And I'm wondering if we have an opportunity in the current atmosphere of decolonization and asking the question of even rethinking how spaces like this might be reimagined or rethought in terms of what it means for women to gather, or okay, not just women, but for scholars to gather and to try and reimagine, to think and talk about things. When we had the launch of Collective Amnesia at UCT, one of the things that came up was this idea of it feeling like a stokvel, right? And women coming together to share their stories. And what we actually did was to take away chairs and tables. We sat on the floor, except for the panel, which I now think we probably should have also sat on the floor. But it completely, so you had students, lecturers, heads of departments all sitting on the chair, on the floor. And it completely changed the dynamics of who could speak and who could say what. And I'm wondering if, even in this space, and there was the mention earlier of the history of what universities are and the legacy in Africa as a whole, I was really intrigued by how you used all these different elements to present a sort of multisensory experience. So I'm wondering for you, or maybe anyone in the room, if we were to think of a space like this and think about decolonization and presentation of knowledge and drawing from existing knowledge systems and collaboration, what that might look like.
That was such a lovely comment. I have a slightly different comment or question to Joy, and it's coming from a place of ignorance. You discussed two examples of Senegalese literature, and that kind of reminded me of Cheikh Anta Diop's work on, the idea that Africa, that Africa before colonization and Africa before Arabization was was composed of matriarchal societies. An idea that Ifeoma Njuma then picks up and carries. And at least in my engagement with West African scholars, this idea of classical matriarchy seems to be quite sort of prevalent. And I was wondering, how do you see the relationship between Stiwanism and the thesis of classical matriarchy that has its roots in Cheikh Anta Diop's work?
Trying to take that last sentence.
The relationship between Stiwanism and the idea that African societies are at heart or originally matriarchal.
Thanks.
I have a question for Brendon. And Klein's breasts. Your reading of Klein's breasts in relation to your reading of Walker's reading of Beaton and her milk. And I wondered I'm wondering what happens to clients' breasts if the breast is less an attachment to a particular form of subject to the human, but she really refers to the production. You know, right? So she's dealing with capital and production and an appendage, something more machinic. And so she's making an observation that's also a relation about her situation in relation to the mistress, which doesn't valorize one human over another, but recognizes, but is implicitly anti-humanist in the observation. So what happens to clients' breasts in that, where the breast is neither the shredded one or the nurturing one, but is simply an attachment?
Or if I might add, and I had breast cancer, if it's that kind of breast.
I'll take a half a guess. I mean, the Evangelist Klein precedes the paper. I've just written something on Sarajevo's Social Boy and discovered Klein at about the same time. And the reading of what she's doing with introjective projective identification, and that becoming the basis on which all of our later supposedly more sophisticated dispositions are kind of propped, seem to me to suggest that as human beings we're hardwired to consume and pollute. So in other words, introjective projective, the breast, anal urethral impulses, and I was reading environmentally, and I wanted to collapse any kind of discrepancy between higher order and lower order thinking, and simply thereby argue that we need an environmentally inclined psychoanalysis that exceeds the human subject. So I've got a lot of sympathy with the question. I hadn't thought of the possibility, but having read the full poem post writing the reading of Walker's reading of Wheatley, I think it's a viable reading. I just hadn't thought of it. And if that's what she's doing, then I think her provocation is valid. And I also think that even if she's shifting the figures of the poem into another kind of capitalist-focused reading, that's fine. But it's really, really strange that each of these figures seem to half downplay or dismiss their precursors, and that seems like a pattern. And it's not one that I think is problematic. I just want to see what its strategic use is. Does that halfway answer your question?
Okay, thank you very much. I hope my first response was not too personal, but I needed to be a bit practical. Like the pastors who say, when you hear the word, you act on words. I have read the book and I'm acting, so that's why I gave that comment on the first question. I hope you are comfortable with it. Just mind. Okay, for now. Now, let me take it from another perspective. On the first comment, she said, current atmosphere of decolonization. I want to say to us here, one thing that helps me to survive is being positive. I try to close my eyes to the negativity I see about anybody. Now, as women, when you talked about decolonization, another woman is your teammate. You do not fight against your teammate. You fight against the opponent, not against your team. She's my teammate. So no matter what we have, we sort ourselves and say, if we start fighting against ourselves, then we're already losing. The opponent will score. So we start from those of us as women to see ourselves as teammates about to get something. So you close your eyes and the negativity about that teammate, you see the positive in your teammate. Every woman has a unique talent. Every woman seated here has something special and exceptional about her. You do yourself a lot of good by seeing the positive, no matter how the person tries to come up. That is not existing. There is something we need to do. So if we see ourselves, everybody here, as one team, you are brighter, I'm not as bright as yourself, I take from you and add to my own, you take from me, you add, we are forming a force, then we can talk about decolonization. Because once we start fighting when I say fight, I'm not talking about, you know, when you don't seem to appreciate what she is doing and you're trying to do what they call the PhD syndrome, the pull him down syndrome or the pull her down syndrome. I was the one, you see, that's why I came to Rhodes. Rhodes helps me to think. PhD is not, it's even a virus that is attached to PhD. If you are not firm as a woman, when the PhD virus attacks you, either in your first or second year, you are out of Rhodes. So when you are attacked, you take the vaccine, and then you you come back. So that's the first thing, is seeing ourselves. Let me say, endeavor to see ourselves as one, work together. What is working and what is not working? What do we need to throw away? What do we need to add? Contribution to knowledge, and then we could talk about decolonization. So if you cannot, okay, that's that. And then the second one is Stiwanism. African societies as originally matriarchal. Let me start by saying I did not talk about African societies. No, I was specific. I said Francophone Africa. The Francophone Africa where I come from is a patriarchal society. Matriarchy exists, but it exists in a different form. It is, when the French say fortement patriarcal, not just patriarchal, fortement. When the French uses the fortement, it means there is something else. It's strong and it's just there. So when you have faced society, Stiwanism, and so matriarchy, for me, I would say it's existing, but we're seeing a patriarchal society. So already, because it's a patriarchal society, you should just know that there is domination, there is oppression, there is marginalization, there's humiliation, there is battery, everything that is associated, in quotes, with that. So that is why when I brought about Stiwanist study, when you are faced with such situations, what do? The first thing you try to do is put yourself together and endeavor not to give up. Now let me say that there's a French philosopher that says, "Il y a l'ordre dans le désordre." Il y a l'ordre dans le désordre. There is orderliness in disorderliness. What do you do when you find yourself in a deplorable situation? Remember that, let's go back to the text. Yetunde was imprisoned because she tried to kill attempted murder. Now, staying in the prison, did she get, okay, this is the end of my world? No. That is where she met with other people who were not arrested because they committed crimes, because of their writings, some because they spoke against the God. And then she started learning. Let me say that she had elle avait un carnet in French, diary. So she was writing, this one would come, right? In that, her prison state, it was a way for her to, what they call renouvellement. She had to come up with something. That is how she was learning from somebody in Europe, somebody from France, and when she came out, she excelled. Now, when she came back home and she met that the husband had married another woman, I told you that I didn't want to talk about sterility because a lot of scholars are talking about sterility. I talked about female genital mutilation. Once she, as a woman, I said Francophone Africa, not this. Once you are a woman and you have challenges with sterility, you should just know that the automatic